As we all know, as documentary filmmakers, storytelling is the art, but oftentimes what gets that art made is our ability to be a good communicator, and that starts before we even get out the camera. This might sound like basic stuff, but if you want to raise money for your projects or work with larger clients or get hired, on funded documentary crews, there's a few easy to learn skills that can make the difference. So here's where all this comes from. Over the past couple years, I've been asked to do more and more lectures at colleges and high schools, probably just because I'm getting older and I've got some experience. I don't know. But here's what professors and teachers told me, that at most schools these days, they don't teach basic communication skills about how to write emails, text etiquette, or how to communicate over the phone. They said that's for the employer or other people to teach them. This is coming from professors. This isn't stuff I was making up. So this gave me a deep sense of empathy for people who are just entering the workplace. Because to be honest, when I first started making films, I didn't know how to do any of this stuff, but I quickly learned how important it was when I was introduced to my first funder of one of my first projects, and they told me that they wanted to produce a documentary in Africa on animal conservation. I was so excited about this, and then they said, what they just needed from me is to send over a proposal. That excitement turned immediately into panic because I had no idea how to write one of those things. The proposal was the first problem because I didn't know how to write one of those. But on top of that, I didn't know how to write professional emails, or should I text or call with questions as we developed the script. But here's the thing. They told me that they had $50,000 for this project. So needless to say, I got really motivated to figure all this stuff out. I'll come back to that story, but let's jump into this stuff so you don't have to learn it the way I did, the hard way. So as we all know, there are dozens of ways to communicate with people these days. Let's break down some of these, and I'll start with email. So bad email etiquette, it's not going to tank your career, but professional emails can really change how confident and capable you come across as a doc filmmaker. So here's 4 basic tips that can greatly improve your emails, and I just have seen they make a big difference. So number 1, make sure you have an email signature that gives people your information. That's at the bottom of your email. This includes your phone number, website, social channels, and the city and state that you live in can be just a nice touch. You can create an auto signature in Apple Mail, and this just adds it to every email you write in the future. All right, number 2, make sure you have a clear subject line. This is the first thing people are going to read. It should tell your subject why you're emailing and what your email is about. Number 3, make sure spelling and grammar is correct. I'm massively dyslexic and I make this mistake all the time. But this leads to number 4. Use ChatGPT as a tool for this. Just ask it to check grammar and spelling. If you're struggling with how to say something in your email, you can also ask ChatGPT to simplify your writing to make your emails more clear and concise. The main thing is to keep the tone of your emails clear and respectful. A well-written email can build trust even before you meet anyone face to face. Let me give you one last tip. Be cautious about the length of your email. Keep it direct, easy to read, and to the point. Long emails can feel overwhelming and they can often get ignored. So now let's talk about social media messaging. This can be tricky. As we all know, these platforms are more informal. They're a great place to connect with people. If you're trying to reach out to someone like a filmmaker that doesn't list their email, and sending a direct message can be a great starting place. So this is something I would write to a potential partner or collaborator or somebody I wanted to work with. Hi, Chris, I'm an impact documentary filmmaker and I'm working on a project about a one-of-a-kind wheelchair designed in Guatemala that gives kids autonomy. I'd love to connect about working together on the project. Do you have an email where I can send a few details? I keep it short, professional, and respectful. In the text, I try to include my email and my phone number so that they know exactly where to find me in case they just want to directly reach out. If they don't respond, follow up a week later. And if they don't, hit you back up, you don't want to come across like a stalker. So I'd probably back off for a month or 2. All right. The goal with social media messaging is basically move the conversation to a more professional environment because that's where transactions happen. Now let's talk about texting. As we all know, this is an informal space, but recently we've seen more and more professional communications happen over text. However, it's a good idea to consider what you're texting about. It's perfect for confirming quick information, things that need attention or arrival times or general conversation. But if you're discussing ideas, money, or anything that needs a paper trail, email is a much better place to move the conversation. Okay, now let's talk about using the phone. Yes, I know people still use the phone. Phone calls can be an incredibly effective place to talk through complex issues, pitch ideas or visions that actually you need to include emotion. It also can be an incredible space to resolve misunderstandings. FaceTime can be even better than that. A voice conversation can humanize a situation in a way text can't. The main thing to remember with phone calls is to be clear, be a listener, and if it's important information, follow up with email as a recap to make sure everybody is on the same page. So one tip that I want to mention about phone calls, when you start a professional conversation, let the other person know why you're calling and how much time you need on this conversation. It allows you to end the call if it goes long without any awkwardness, or if somebody's just talking, and you want to get off the phone, you can let them know, I only have 15 minutes. I've got to run. Time's up. All right. The last thing I want to talk about is mail. Physical mail is still a thing, especially when it comes to formal thank you notes and gifts. Sending a handwritten note to a major collaborator, a funder, or a subcontractor, or a screening host can leave a lasting impact unlike anything else. It's that magic touch that builds an important relationship. So I need to mention that recently we worked with Cloud9, and they did the sound finish for our film, The Power is Small. And a few days after we finished, we had sent them the contract, everything went well, and they send the film back. We finished the project, and about 2 weeks later, I get 2 bags of coffee, a nice thank you note with biscotti. It wasn't a big job, but do you know who I'm going to work with next? These guys are amazing. They understood mail. All right, there's one thing that I want to mention that's really important. Communication is a two-way street. It's just as important to get back to people with inappropriate time frame. So here's a few tips on timelines for when you should respond. For phone calls about professional jobs, you should get back to people the same day or within 24 hours. For text messaging, this is up to you, but within a few hours. For professional conversations is the basic rule. For email, 24 to 48 hours, basically one business day. For social media DMs, it's 1 to 3 days. I'd suggest sooner if it's a job that someone's trying to fill. Here's the thing. There's a lot more in here. There's Zoom, there's all these things, but the principle is to be timely, kind, and efficient with your communication. But the email is a big one. And I'm seeing more and more that you get good at email, you get hired. All right, like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next video.